So it's a great pleasure to have Heather Joseph joining us as our opening speaker today. Heather Joseph is the Executive Director of the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, known to us all as SPARC, an international coalition of academic and research libraries promoting the open sharing of knowledge. Under her stewardship, SPARC has become the leading advocacy organization promoting innovative, open, and equitable global systems of research and education. Based in Washington, D.C., Heather leads SPARC's strategy and policy work, which led to the establishment of the landmark 2022 White House OSTP memorandum requiring open access to all U.S. federally funded research outputs. She's a widely respected expert on national and international open research policies, practices, and implementation strategies. And prior to joining SPARC, Heather spent 15 years as a publisher in both commercial and nonprofit journal publishing organizations. She's deeply engaged in the global knowledge sharing community, serves on the board of directors of organizations ranging from the Arcadia Fund to Public Research to Our Research. She's a frequent speaker and writer on scholarly communication in higher education and on open access to research in particular. She and I had a wonderful get-ready conversation just last week, and I can't think of a better person to open up our meeting. Heather, if you'll join us, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jake. We had a wonderful prep conversation, Jacob, Jen, and I, and they're being very kind because given the ridiculous amount of activity that's happening in the policy environment, I somehow managed to be, like a half an hour late for it, and you all were still there and waiting for me, and I cried, I apologized, the whole 10 yards. So thank you so much. It really is a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you this morning. And certainly in these, again, challenging times, which Jake asked me to spend a little time kind of walking through some strategies for how do we actually, in the day-to-day, the reality, navigate sustaining access to knowledge in, I think what is the understated title of the decade, this challenging political landscape. Make sure I do, in fact, know how to advance. Okay, here. We are not advancing. Here we go.
So we should just do these ones.
There we go. Perfect. Once again, Jen to the rescue. So I do want to open by acknowledging that I fully recognize what a difficult time this is for our community, for our libraries, of course, for our higher education institutions that we're nested in, for the research ecosystem, and for our society as a whole. And on a personal level, we're all human, and I am wrestling, as you all are, with library leaders, with just the notion of getting up every day and recognizing that it's my job to help keep things moving forward. I think I spend a lot of time thinking about and working on how do you focus on continuing to build towards strategic goals in times of really unprecedented chaos and uncertainty. And at SPARC, that translates to specifically, how do we keep making progress towards the goal of open research, of making sure that everyone everywhere can both access and contribute to, as well as benefit from the research that shapes our world. This current environment is not normal. There is such a huge volume of noise in the political realm of activities, of actions that happen every day. You'll notice some coordination of those actions. I think they really are designed to keep people off balance, to keep people reacting. There's also so much emphasis on destruction, on what is being torn down, what's being cut, what's being eliminated, what's being thrown out. And it would be difficult enough to operate in that environment if it were just programs. I'm sorry, it's advancing on its own. I do not know why it's doing that. There's no automation necessary there. It would be difficult to do that, right? To focus or to operate in destruction if it were just programs and initiatives that this were happening to. But it's also happening to people, right? It's happening to people in our libraries, on our campuses, and throughout our federal workforce. And as difficult as that is, and as emotional as that is to deal with on a day-to-day basis, it's also something that's really helping me personally to focus I know I have to keep thinking about what comes next. What happens after the wrecking ball finally stops swinging? Because it will stop at some point. We know that will happen. My job is to try to help my organization, my team, my community focus on what it is we are building towards. What actions can we take today that'll help us continue to build towards the vision of the research and knowledge sharing environment that we ultimately want to enable? What can we do to help ourselves and to help each other? Minimize the time we spend reacting in this environment and maximize the time that we spend on actions that preserve what we can save, protect what foundational or operational aspects we can protect, and then really, really, really focus on what we can actively build, laying the foundations, the pieces of the foundation, however small they may feel like they are today, needed to build the future that we collectively want. CRL has a very particular remit in this space, as do we in SPARC, in the library community. And at SPARC, we're tasked with being a catalyst for action, with not only articulating the sweeping, aspirational, and hopefully inspirational drivers for openly sharing research and scholarship and knowledge, but also with really honing in on how to identify and activate points of action that help us make meaningful progress towards our end goal and collective vision. And that collective vision that we have at SPARC is a really big one. We believe that sharing knowledge is, at its heart, a human right, and that everyone, everywhere, should be able to access, contribute to, and benefit from the knowledge that shapes our world. And of course, we didn't come up with that vision in a vacuum. This is a construct that's articulated and enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where Article 27 specifically notes that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, enjoy the arts, and most specifically, to share in scientific advancements and benefits. And at SPARC, if you know us, you probably equate us with open access, open research, open knowledge, open science, open scholarship, and that's a correct correlation. But I do want to spend a minute to just note that we focus on open in a very specific way. We focus on the use of open as an enabling strategy to achieve that core vision of realizing the free sharing of knowledge as a human right. It's an enabling strategy and not an end to itself. We don't advocate for open access in order to just make research articles open, for example. Not open for open's sake, but open in order to, right? What can we use open as a tool or an enabling strategy to achieve? Opening up access to articles and data in order to prevent a pandemic or bring a faster end to the COVID-19 pandemic, accelerate discovery, accelerate the translation of basic research into treatments, therapies, cures, right? That open in order to. Opening up access to textbooks, teaching and learning materials in order to make college more affordable and accessible to as many students as possible. Opening up access to research outputs like data, code, algorithms, software, in order to improve the reliability, reproducibility, and quality of research. And in this era where misinformation and disinformation abounds, and the truth is increasingly fragile, this kind of strategy is increasingly critical as a mechanism, as one tool in the arsenal to help us shore up the public trust in research science and the outputs that come from our research facilities and our campuses. It's a huge challenge, right? Thinking about driving towards access to knowledge as a human right. And we know that, right? And we've known that since we started this work, these 20 some odd years ago. It requires systems level change. And systems level change means changing policies, practices, and norms on the local level, on our campuses, with our faculty, with our students, on the national level, with our policymakers here in DC, and also on the international level, wherever we can make progress in the larger sort of collective global research ecosystem, and in those areas of the research system that we share common cause with global policymakers. But of course, the big question right now that's facing us all is, can you do it? I mean, can we do this work realistically in the face of what's happening to us now, particularly and specifically here in the United States? I do want to recognize that this talk is very centered on responding to the challenges here in the US. I do recognize we have Canadian colleagues in the room. We also operate in a global ecosystem, but in order to frame this particular talk, I am going to address international challenges, but the particular political exigencies that I'm going to focus on are very US-centric at this moment. And it's, I think, because they're so big, right? The challenges that we're facing with the change of this administration have been so daunting, and it feels like the tally is growing exponentially of new things to deal with on a daily basis. They include, everything from funding cuts, right? From funding cuts to basic research, to grant freezes, to rollbacks on funding, to clawbacks of funding that was already allocated to our institutions, to the threat of indirect cost caps, to threaten hikes to our endowment taxes across the board in universities and institutions. We've seen the threats of cuts and funding cuts to the elimination of whole research areas, right? We somehow no longer feel that studying climate change or doing research on anything to do with diversity, equity, inclusivity is important to fund, to the elimination of entire departments in our federal government, entire federal agencies. USAID, as we already heard, was the first, and then in our backyard, IMLS, NEH being threatened with complete cuts. And personnel cuts, right? Rank and file folks, it's where it started with DOGE, across the board in federal agency after federal agency, but extending to experts, the most recent news out of NSF with detailees and senior program folks being cut, and certainly leaderships, which again, we've seen in our backyard just over the last, I don't know, it's been 10 days since the Librarian of Congress and the Register of Copyrights were summarily fired. That has led also to us having to deal with the realities of critical infrastructure being at risk, and the infrastructure that most directly affects our ability as a community to work with our federal partners on the free sharing of knowledge, critical agency platforms that include things that are very fragile at this moment: PubMed Central, the ERIC database at Department of Ed, Agricola at Agriculture, PAR at NSF. And data at risk too, data and information of all kinds. We've seen that selective removal of information happening at federal agency after federal agency, often with no notice, and often what we hear from people inside the agencies with no knowledge of the folks who are responsible for curating that information. The firings, the wrecking ball hitting people means also that we have a lack of experts and people just minding the store. One of the wellness checks that I do on a weekly basis with our federal agency folks is just to do a round of phone calls to see who's still there, helping to keep the lights on in the program areas that affect knowledge sharing deeply. I swear there's only 2 slides on this, and the rest of the talk will be strategies that we can have. But I kind of want to make sure that I lay out why it feels so difficult and so overwhelming and so different than other times we've been operating with changes of administration. Certainly, we're seeing unprecedented interference with academic freedom on all kinds of levels, not just limitations on what you can apply for a grant to study and what kinds of things will be available going forward, but seeing ridiculous documents of words that are no longer acceptable to include in research proposals or in materials from institutions or from federal agencies. We're also seeing unprecedented editorial interference starting to leach out into the publishing atmosphere. A couple of weeks ago, there were letters sent by the Department of Justice to medical journals, asking a series of pointed questions and forcing a response from medical journals to talk about how they are planning on addressing what really can only be described as turning to a task of both sidesism of medical articles, right? How are you going to present both sides of the story of the science that you're reporting on? I mean, really incredible overreach in terms of academic freedom interference. And finally, what I think feels most palpable and difficult to all of us on a day-to-day basis is there's this overall permeating sense and climate of not just uncertainty, but frankly, fear. People are scared. And that is really difficult when the fear is not just like, oh, I'm going to misstep and, I'll make a mistake. But the climate of fear combined with a demonstrated appetite for retribution makes it extraordinarily difficult for us to operate. I've never seen in the 5 administrations that I have worked with since being the executive director of SPARC, executive orders that specifically target individuals or organizations like Harvard or Wikipedia. Really never seen this kind of Department of Justice interference and an appetite for investigation. And we are also seeing that being poised to extend to Congress as well. So that really it's just different beyond all kinds of rational measures. So we've spent the last, what feels like 40 years, but it's been 4 months, really working through with this kind of chaos. Where do you start? What's solid? How do you know where to begin? And for us at SPARC, one of the things that we did and continue to do is that we've really gone back to basis. And starting with the policy environment, that's really where we've worked to intentionally keep ourselves out of that desire to react, right, to swat at everything that's happening, every individual action that comes out on a day-to-day basis, and instead say, no, what we're going to do is systematically revisit what's working, what is continuing to function, what has allowed us to make progress in the past in the policy environment, and what is it that's still solid that we can keep working on. Specifically, we've been focused on underscoring areas of shared values and first principles that we still have in common with policymakers and looking for ways to reinforce them as that first step, right, as that way to define bedrock as something solid to put your feet on when you get out of bed and start to do the work every day. Kind of shorthanding it as where do we continue to have common cause with policymakers nationally, internationally, and institutionally on a local basis, and how do we use that as a starting point to continue to build from? In the open access space, in the open research or open scholarship space sort of writ large, we do have a key construct that our advocacy has been based on since we really started this work in the early 2000s. And that is that just general idea, that notion that the public deserves access to the knowledge generated by public funds. It's a construct that we've worked firmly to establish, as I said, not only here in the US, but also internationally. So a first order of business for us really has been to go back to basics, to work to ensure that this idea is represented, reinforced, and reaffirmed by policymakers throughout the ecosystem. I'm going to start with the work that we're doing globally and internationally, move to nationally, and then end with the work that is happening on our campuses and within our libraries. On the international level, we've focused on really pulling and focusing on overarching frameworks that have broad support at the ministerial and country, sort of nation-state levels. And an example of the construct of public access or taxpayer access to publicly funded research in action that continues to be extraordinarily helpful to us is an articulation by the Organization of Economic, OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which we worked with in the early 2000s to really kind of create an underlying framework for access to knowledge policies to be appended to or, kind of hung off of, if you will. The OECD reaffirmed, back in 2005 that government information, of which publicly funded research is a subset, is a valuable national resource, and the economic benefits to society are maximized when it's available in a timely and equitable manner to all. That's that basic bedrock principle that we can go back to and remind folks when they're, thinking we have to amend our policy or we can't do X. It's no, this has been the operating construct for the last 20 years. There is no reason to change it now, and in fact, it should be a guide star, a lodestar for us to work off of. And at SPARC, we're doing that, not only working with our colleagues at the OECD on making sure that we're working on extending and raising the visibility of this construct, but we're trying to do that as well with entities like UNESCO, where we partner with them on important foundational language on recommendations for open science that echo this construct and keep this principle front and center. We're also really working actively to support our colleagues who are doing work on the international level that we can't at this point. The G7 and the G20 science and tech ministerials literally just concluded a couple of weeks ago, and no U.S. representatives went to the, no high level, I should say, U.S. representatives went to the recent G20 meeting in South Africa. But our colleagues in SPARC Africa were able to pick up the ball and actually advocate for the inclusion of these principles in the latest documentation that the G20 is creating, and are now working to promote this principle and the inclusion on a document that will promote community-centered, institutional-based open access mechanisms like Diamond Open Access in documentation that will be coming out of that meeting, and then hoping to get that information included into the general ministerial meetings that will happen in September. So to make these principles visible, and I want to credit the Knox from the South African Research Fund and Reggie Raju from the University of Cape Town for being the representatives who are really carrying that work very visibly forward. We also at SPARC are working with the United Nations through the United Nations Library. It's the third in a series of meetings that global meetings that we're partnering with them on. And we're working to put together the program for a meeting in October in Tokyo, which will reaffirm the global importance of this principle in global research communication policy. So that international work, even in these really difficult times, is something that, by going back to that first principles, we can help to keep driving forward. And we're taking the same basic approach on the national policy front. It's not pretty today, but one of the things that's really important to note and to remember is that we have a very long, a 20-year-long bipartisan history of support for the concept of taxpayer access to taxpayer-funded research. It was first affirmed in 2005, again. I mean, I feel like I've been doing this since before the lights came on with electricity. It feels like yesterday and yet a long time ago as I'm talking. It was first reaffirmed way back then, but it has since been reaffirmed multiple times by a wide variety of policymakers in the U.S. But most recently, in 2012, it was actively reaffirmed in the Nelson Memorandum that noted that the insights of research should be immediately available, not just break glass in the time of emergency, but at every moment, and that there should be no daylight between the taxpayers and the return on their investment in research, right? Access to this information. That is incredibly important, right? This came out under the Biden-Harris administration, of course, but as I said, we've had every administration from Bush to Biden to the last Trump administration affirm this principle. The Trump 1.0 administration supported this concept. An executive order was actually awaiting the president's signature when the first term ended. And we've been doing lots and lots of systematic outreach to people in this iteration of the administration. And so far, what we're hearing is confirmation that the support for that principle stands. It's really notable that OSTP, and OMB are led by individuals that have a direct history in supporting that construct in the executive order in the last administration, and that they continue to support this underlying policy goal. We've also seen that demonstrated by some federal agencies so far. HHS in late April issued a brand new scientific integrity policy that covers all the HHS agencies, including the NIH, the CDC, and beyond, that specifically refers to and reinforces immediate free availability of taxpayer-funded research articles and data, reinforces the Nelson Memo, and in fact uses it as a footnote to say, this is our policy and here's why. And as you all know, in early May, the NIH director actually made accelerating implementation of the Nelson Memo one of the first actions that he took when coming into office. And we're very actively doing this affirmation, right, this reinforcement of that construct with the 119th Congress, as we always do. You know, we have been doing policy work, again, for 20 years. It always involves boot leather, many meetings in Congress, and so we're certainly doing this with the 119th Congress, really working to educate new members as they're coming in so they're aware of this policy construct. They know that this is the kind of underlying law of the land, and working to cultivate champions so that bipartisan acceptance and support for this stays strong. We've heard a lot of noise since the election from various corners in our ecosystem that the Nelson Memo is dead, that open access is dead, that this will never go forward. But as I said, as we've been doing the legwork, and it's me who's been on the Hill. I think you all know we are my beloved Katie Steen, who was our lead policy manager for advocacy, recently in January went to the Open Source Institute to work on tech policy for open source software. So this is me who fills in the interim. We have a wonderful new person who is starting on June 1st, but I can tell you firsthand that meeting with offices, the support and the interest in this issue is deep. There are some issues with the enthusiasm for the issue on the very far right Republican side, I will say. We do have some concerns that there was a bit of we really don't like that the primary opponents of this policy are international publishers not headquartered in the United States, whose tax dollars don't go here, and maybe this should be a DOGE issue. And we are working really hard to try to say that's not, this is not a punitive policy. This is not a punish someone policy. This is a positive construct of what we're trying to do is ensure equitable access to publicly funded information. Doing the legwork is difficult, but it's critical, and I will say one of the things that it's actually helping us do is see what the next steps that are productive and positive might look like for us. Where do we go? You can reaffirm those policy constructs, but you can't stay in that space for 4 years. I mean, that's not that. I mean, we could, I suppose, but it doesn't feel like that's the most productive thing to do. But it has allowed us, right, being visible and continuing to be visible as we have in building these long-term, multi-year, and in many cases, multi-decadal relationships with congressional offices. It's allowed us to have some really productive discussions about upcoming congressional and administration priorities, particularly around AI. And we are seeing a strategic alignment emerging among library priorities and goals, including some of our policy goals around open access and emerging AI policy developing. We see that potential to incorporate our priorities, including open access policies, into larger bipartisan initiatives. The National Artificial Intelligence Research Resource, the NARE, for example, is in the process of being extended. It is a natural place for partnership on our issues, as is the proposed American Science Acceleration Project, which was recently proposed on a bipartisan basis in the Senate. which provide not only opportunities for us to get library principles and priorities fresh in the minds of policymakers, but also offer potential pathways to codify different aspects of open research policy into permanent U.S. law. SPARC as CRL cares deeply about collective action. And this time, I think collective action could not possibly be more important. We found this is a great time for us to really extend and accelerate our work in supporting shared library community priorities in a wide variety of ways by expanding our coalition work. We have always led in terms of coalition work on open access with the Open Access Working Group, the Alliance for Taxpayer Access, all kinds of different groups. We've very visibly and actively supported copyright legislation and copyright policy through the Recreate Coalition. But this is the playing field and the problem set is much broader. So we've actually expanded the kinds of coalitions that we are active in now, starting with rejoining Research America, which we had been members of in the past, but we decided to rejoin specifically because they are active in congressional appropriations for research to federal agencies. That is a key issue for our institutions that our libraries are nested in. We want to lend our voices in support to protecting federal appropriations for research wherever possible. We've also upped our 10-year plus advocacy efforts as members of the Data Coalition. As data sets and information are removed, working in concert with the larger data community, which does include companies, for-profit entities, who also care deeply about equitable and sustainable access to federal research, federal information, federal data. That has been a coalition that has increased in importance for us in terms of participation. And recently, we also have been very active in supporting actions that have been led by the ACLU, in specific, working to fight provisions that have surfaced in both executive orders as well as in the recent tax bill, designed to really target not-for-profit organizations' tax-exempt status by unilaterally allowing the federal government to designate without due process any nonprofit as a terrorist-supporting organization. We're not going to be able to spin up coalitions on our own to fight it. So finding those who are leading and being as proactive in adding our voices to that framework is a really critical strategy. And the last level that we're working on is the level that you all are working on as well on a day-to-day basis, and that is the driving and supporting local/institutional policies, practices, and norms. It's almost a tougher environment, honestly, on a day-to-day basis than the international and national policy environment is right now. The level of stress, the level of budgetary pressure, the level of socio-political issues that our institutions, our institutional leaders, that you all are dealing with on a day-to-day basis is incredible. I mean, it encompasses all of the things on the two doomsday slides, plus new things that emerge in the environment. And it comes coupled with the desire to protect our faculty, to protect our students, to protect our workers on our campuses. This is not the time, we recognize at SPARC, to be adding anything to a university leader's to-do list, right? We shouldn't be going to our university administrators and saying, hey, by the way, like now we want you to be paying extra uber attention to open and open policy. That's not going to happen. So instead at SPARC, the approach that we're really trying to intentionally take is the approach of not forcing you have to do this to support us or open, but rather really working to reinforce how institutional and local open policies and practices can support them in their own work and their practices. And we really do have, again, that foundational support of presidents and provosts repeatedly affirming that this is something that is important to them. It's not the top of the priority list, but this is an excerpt from an open letter from 27 university presidents and provosts was, I think, one of the first times that this concept was articulated, which is the broad dissemination, right? The open sharing of the results of scholarly inquiry is essential for higher education to fulfill its longstanding commitment to the advancement and conveyance of knowledge. Indeed, it's mission critical. It's that mission criticality, is that even a word? It's that mission critical aspect where we speak to the university leaders in terms of, we get that that's your job, right, to advance the mission of the institution. What we want to be talking to them about is how what we're doing and how open strategies can help them achieve their own priorities. Yeah, again, it's not a top priority for many, but it is a high priority for a number of folks in the academy. Our strategy at SPARC on this really started back 5 or 6 years ago to really work to establish a structure that would allow us to have regular interactions with that subset of university leaders, whether it's a vice chancellor for research, provost, a president, who self-identifies as understanding and supporting the fact that open policies and practices can serve them as a personal enabling strategy to achieve their own institution's mission. And we positioned ourselves to have an entity to support them in that work. And that entity is the Higher Education Leaders in Open Scholarship Program, or the Helios program. They have been meeting regularly for about the last 4.5 years. And that entity is something that's available to us as a tool to help hear from university leaders about how we can productively work with them. And I think most critically, one of the most critical things that we can do to actively support them is to utilize Helios and that group of institutional leaders and connect them with another group that at SPARC we've worked for the last 10 years to establish a similar structure and a similar operating relationship with. And that is private philanthropies under the Open Research Funders Group that we have worked to convene on a monthly basis for the last 10 years. So the Open Research Funders Group is a group of about 21 and change private philanthropies, all of whom have policies requiring open sharing of their research outputs. And we've worked with them to establish a space for not just knowledge exchange, but community building so that they could get to know one another and understand where there may be opportunities for them to work collectively to support open practices, policies, infrastructure strategies. That is a place that is, I think, more important than ever in this environment as federal funds are cutting, to have a ready place where we can connect the communities of funders and university leaders in a space where they can have an open dialogue about what might they need, and the funders can be there potentially to help them move things forward. We've done that, and we do that regularly. We try to look for places where we can convene folks. The National Academies is a ready-made sort of home base for these kinds of convenings. We've done them productively through things like the roundtable for realigning incentives to support open scholarship, and we're actively working with both groups right now to look at when the time is right. Like, we don't want to load more things onto people's plates, but how can we bring these communities together so that they can have these kinds of sustained dialogues to look for opportunities for kind of supportive actions that can support both of them. SPARC is a catalyst for action, right? So catalyzing these opportunities is high on our radar screen, and it's a long game, right? We founded the ORFG 10 years ago, Helios 5 years ago. These are not things that happen overnight, but you build them, you nurture them, you build them for purpose. You hope you never have a situation like we have today, but we got it. But we're not starting from zero. And that's, I think, a big message that I want to give. We always play for the long game, and we're not starting from zero in this environment. I'm going to close with just a little bit more in terms of things that we can do from the individual library perspective and as collectives of libraries in this environment that I think can be useful. On the pragmatic front, we've been talking about policies. We also want to talk about practices that we can encourage that utilize open as an enabling strategy that help our institutions and can be a direct help as they grapple with like these incredible budget exigencies. We can really work to reinforce policy constructs by driving solutions that don't require high APCs or subscription costs. So at SPARC, we're accelerating our work to provide resources to help our libraries reduce information asymmetries in publisher negotiations, for example, through our negotiations community of practice, provide advice and support in breaking commercial publisher bundles or getting out of read and publish agreements or transformative agreements that are no longer serving financial needs, working with strategies to redirect and reinvest spends on things like, again, non-APC-based OA mechanisms. Raim Crow, my colleague at SPARC, worked with the not-for-profit publishing community to create a risk mitigation transition strategy for cost management and risk management, financial risk management, called Subscribe to Open. We are upping our work in organizing a knowledge-sharing community on Diamond Open Access, and of course, building on open platforms and open source solutions. This is also a time, I think, for us to double down on really working on how to support how our faculty and students really want to share their work. In a time where everything's up in the air, there are opportunities. The pressures that are on the system are breaking things, and they're going to break some more things. Some of that's shitty. I mean, it's bad. But some of them are things that, some of the things that break might actually be things that researchers no longer actually want to use, right? They may no longer be fit for purpose, and that's why they'll break. And I do think it's worth our community being aware and ready to capitalize productively on the situation. Some disciplines, some areas may want to continue traditional journals. That's fine. How do we support that in this environment? But some may be ready to move to a more rapid environment for preprints, locally prioritized collections. They may want to deposit into repositories. They may want to experiment with publish, review, curate models, micro-publications, annotated data sets, other models that might be out there. So it's this, within every crisis is an opportunity. That's a truism. But it is actually something that in this environment is useful for us to keep our eye on. The fragility of infrastructure and information availability is the last area that, I think libraries, we're well aware of. It's also the question that I get most frequently. SPARC doesn't work directly on data preservation projects, but of course, libraries understand this area, I think, intuitively, instinctively, and sort of genetically. Collective action has already begun on this, and we are really uniquely positioned to help turbocharge this. With the Data Rescue Project, I think we have a really nice framework for organization of data rescue and collection efforts. What we could do at SPARC is, we're not going to, we don't have individual repositories, but what we could do was connect the data rescue team, the folks who are running it, with the funders that I talked about. So we brought the data rescue people to an in-person meeting with the funders at their annual meeting in March in DC. And funding streams are starting to open up from some of those funders to help to ensure that critical work that things like that initiatives like Data Rescue are doing, like mirroring the ERIC database in less than a week period, move forward. We're also trying to keep our eyes open to work with funders and organizations in the international environment to mirror as well, because fragility of infrastructure in the U.S. is a dangerous combination. So we're particularly gratified to see things like ZBMed, a German information center, stepping up to the plate. So I do want to close by just noting that libraries are not new to these challenges. We understand from hard experience how to operate under extreme budgetary pressures. We know how to run underfunded and understaffed initiatives, infrastructures, the whole ball of wax. We understand and have dealt with political interference in the past. We have always shared and operated from a deep commitment to common values and principles. And more importantly, as librarians, as library workers, we live those values every day. And right now, there's a huge temptation, and often we feel and see internal or external pressures to do something immediate, right? Like to do that reactive thing, to blast a tweet, to write a scathing blog, sign on to a statement, or letter. And that's fine, and there's times that that is actually helpful. But I think it's more important to recognize that in the face of all that's being challenged, libraries' very existence is the most potent form of advocacy that we have. The strongest contributions that we can make to resisting the nightmarish chaos around us is to come in every day and do the work according to our principles and values. And at SPARC, we tried to capture this when we articulated our approach to social and political events a few years back. We really tried to operate from our core principles and values, and to say that essentially we're committed to speaking through our actions, small and large, minute by minute, day by day, year by year. And we deeply believe in the ultimate cumulative effectiveness of taking this approach as individuals, as an organization, and as members of our global community. So sharing knowledge is a human right, and it's fundamental to the progress of our society. I feel in my bones how privileged I am to be able to do this work with you every day and to try to make that happen. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today.